on Earth, which premiered in the 2012 Toronto Film Festival before its nationwide theatrical release, and The Short Game, which won the Audience Award at the 2013 South by Southwest Film Festival and was picked up as Netflix's first original documentary. His next film, Can You Dig This?, won the Grand Jury Prize in the 2015 LA Film Festival before being released theatrically in over 30 cities. In 2017, he produced the South by Southwest Audience Award-winning Becoming Bond, as well as Too Funny to Fail as part of Hulu's first original documentary slate. He executive produced the six-part documentary series Hunting ISIS, which premiered this past spring on the History Channel, and is currently executive producing a six-part true crime series for the Sundance Channel. His documentaries, Mike Wallace is Here and Ask Dr. Ruth, premiered alongside his scripted film, Honey Boy, at the Sundance Film Festival in 2019. So please help me welcome Mr. Rafael Marmer. Hello, Rafael.
Hello.
Welcome to Texas.
Thank you very much.
So yeah, I think for me, this resonated a lot as a former educator and someone who works in education, and obviously living on the border down in South Texas, a lot of the similarities. So for you, just with this film having so many layers of conversation across this country, what to you stood out, whether it's through the immigration lens, through the education lens, or both? What resonated to you as somebody who was able to go through this film in its entirety?
Well, when the project was first brought to us, the idea of the story was already incredible. That the biggest football game in the country was played between two Latino high schools. 26,000 people on average come every year to watch this football game. So on the surface already, I was blown away. I'd lived in LA for 12 years and never once heard of this game, which, you know, I'm a sports fan. I think a lot of people had never heard of it. And then the second thing was, with everything going on politically right now, it was so incredibly relevant and important, I felt, to tell this story right now. I mean, the game has been going on for 80 years, and it's been drawing crowds like that for, you know, most of it. Right. You know, most of those 80 years. But I think there was no better time to be telling this story than right now.
So what's interesting, you say it's been going on for 80 years, and you, as a resident of LA, did not even know that this was occurring. So that begs the question for me, is it because they're two fully Hispanic entities? Because right here in Texas, or not, yeah, we're here in Texas, some of the biggest rivalries are, you know, pretty much all white or all African American, and they have notoriety nationwide. So my question to you is, this has been going on 80 years. What's your perspective on why nobody knows about it?
Well, I mean, you know, it introduces it at the beginning of the film that East LA is known as the Ellis Island of the West, and that's where immigrant groups had been coming into California. It was a Russian neighborhood, probably about, you know, 90 years ago. Then it was a very Jewish neighborhood, and about 20 to 30 years ago, it became, I mean, now it's 99% Latino. And I think, you know, part of it is it's kind of an overlooked area of Los Angeles. You know, I think when you think of East LA now, you think of, you know, kind of gangs, you may think of Cheech and Chong, et cetera, but it's an area that has such rich history. We spent, you know, a good 2 years basically, you know, living in that neighborhood, being there every day. And it's a very proud neighborhood. And it's, you know, it's just rich with a lot of history and pride.
Thank you. So I have a question for the audience. Who knew about this 80-year rivalry before watching this film? One person. And is that because you knew about the film, or you actually knew that these high schools existed?
Yes, I knew.
Wow. Okay. Wow. So that's indicative, though, of I think the attention statewide or nationwide. So I noticed, especially at the beginning, that you had a lot of media sound bites. A lot of media sound bites that are very hostile towards immigrants or hostile towards the immigrant community. My question to you is, us on the outside who may be politically involved or aware of the conversation, are aware how immigrants are portrayed, those individuals that were in your film, whether it was the family members or the students themselves, were they immune to these conversations, or did you pick up on the fact that they had an idea that that this is the way they're viewed, this is the way they're talking about, they're being talked about, whether they're immigrants or native Mexicans.
Oh yeah, I mean they were very hyper aware
Okay.
of these conversations, and I think what we were trying to do is really put this story into the context of what is currently happening, and so that it didn't feel what we always try to do with our films is tell kind of a smaller story that you can really get emotionally involved in, but that tells it paints a much bigger picture. And I think the idea of using kind of these big national radio sound bites and television sound bites from kind of the biggest broadcasts and radio stations, it really takes it out of this community and brings it to the discussion that's happening in the entire country.
Thank you. So on the conversation of being hyper aware, also I felt I was a little confused, but it was a good confusion because although they are hyper aware, I felt like as a student of social justice that at times there was somehow internalized racism or internalized depression. For instance, with a girlfriend, calling her a beaner, or in other instances where they describe them not in the greatest light. And so for you, what kind of chord did that strike for you in that conversation of, although they're hyper aware, there's still some sense of internalized oppression or racism that exists even as young students?
Oh, for sure. And I mean, it was something that we were, of course, very aware of. And our job is really to put the camera and just watch the real life unfold. So you do see a lot of that. We want to make these films with warts and all, so you really see it's hopefully these stories are very real and the film feels very real. I think one of the other kind of very nuancy things that I think it hits what you're talking about is the story of the quarterback Stevie Williams, who he's kind of the immigrant coming into this immigrant community, and he's being told, as a black student in a predominantly Latino neighborhood, go back where you came from. You're taking away, our positions in this team, and all the community. We only showed that one discussion, but the community was up in arms that they're letting these kids in from other neighborhoods. So, there's that irony in it as well. And again, it's not, it doesn't reflect fabulously on the community, but it does talk, in a bigger sense of, kind of all of these levels of immigration and kind of, how they're looked on, even in this immigrant community, how it's looking on somebody else as an outsider, is trying to come in.
Yeah. No, that's definitely definitely a good point. Because when I first saw it, that's the first thing that was that I felt like it was real, and it first felt real when the parents of Mario were talking about that they were undocumented. And so when you go on film and this is going to be released to multi-audiences, what was the conversation like and them being scared that ICE is going to watch this and ICE is going to go hunt them down? I mean, that's a true reality, especially under this administration. What kind of conversations or feelings came about with specifically those conversations that are very legal and technically criminal?
Yeah, and with Mario's girlfriend as well, who's undocumented. Yeah. And I mean, the truth of the matter is, which was really weird, is we were more scared for them than they were.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, like we were like, do you want to be saying this on camera? Yeah. Do you not want us to use this in the film? We showed them, we showed everybody the film before we, as we were making it. And amazingly enough, they were like, yes, totally fine. We want our stories to be told, and we're happy for that to be in there. So yeah, we were more scared than they were.
Wow. So I know we've talked a lot about immigration, so let's switch to the other layer of education. I think a lot of their personal testimonies at the end, I think, painted a picture of what the film was trying to accomplish. But I think the example of Mario going to a community college is a microcosm of a lot of what happens in our communities, where you get accepted to the most elite universities. Behind the scenes, what were those conversations like with parents? And I use me as an example because when I got accepted to my college, my mom had a blank face right? Because she didn't know what Brown University was or whatnot. So I'm interested to know what kind of conversations were had and your perceptions and feelings about those conversations, maybe the lack of a value for education.
Well, yeah. I mean, first and foremost, it does introduce it a little bit at the beginning, but traditionally, these schools have not had fantastic graduation rates. In both of the schools. Garfield was actually the school from, where Jaime Escalante was the math teacher from Stand and Deliver. Is notorious. Is a notorious dropout factory, as was Roosevelt. And I think something that certainly the both coaches on the football teams they really speak about was the idea of education and how they use football as a way to make sure that their students have 100% graduation rates. On both football teams, they have 100% graduation rates. So education was a huge conversation in making this film. And I think, something that we realized and I think is important for people to see is, exactly as you mentioned, that conversation really doesn't happen. There's nobody helping Mario to understand how he can navigate through the college application process. His parents have no idea. They don't know what colleges he's even talking about, how they can help him. I think the schools are getting better at doing that, but they're still, I think they still have some ways to go in, really helping and guiding the students. So I think that that's something, again, it's what we hope this movie does is really start a conversation about all of this stuff. And really, yeah.
And that's what I was going to ask to that point is, as a 16-year-old student, you have the immigration conversation, then you have the education conversation, and then with Joseph, you have the parent conversation. How do you think his story, or what was your intention in teasing out his story of being a 16-year-old father on top of being a Hispanic, and top of being a minority, and being in an underserved area of the country? Like, what were your intentions in trying to tease out Joseph's specific story?
Well, I think his was just a very real story that I think people, it's something that, unfortunately a lot of high school kids experience, especially in that neighborhood. And, I think it's important for people to see that. And I think people who are going through it, to see other people going through it. And, I think it's a tough story to watch, but again, it's a very real story. And I think Joseph, he put his head down and he worked through it. And, I think that there's also something inspiring about that, he didn't let it get him down. He just, did what he had to do.
Yeah, okay. Thank you for that. And I'll ask one more question, but then I'll open it up to the audience if they'd like to ask questions. But I don't know if, again, as a student of social justice, I'm looking through a lot of different lenses. One that really stuck out to me, and I don't know if this was your intention, was the idea of the police officer being the coach. And by being the coach, meaning being the mentor, being somebody they can trust, somebody that they trust with their lives, where the debate, if we're talking about the Black Lives Matter movement, et cetera, where it's actually quite the opposite, where you have that police officer that is not to be trusted in most communities, and part of that dialogue. So was that intentional, or tell me a little bit about that whole aspect of that police officer? And again, this may be something I personally just kind of teased out because it's something that I really work on a daily basis.
No, that was actually a discovery midway through the filmmaking, that he was a police officer. He did not. None of the students knew that. He's been a coach there for years. He'd never, because there is still gang activity in the area. It was just not something that he wanted to announce. When we found out about it, it took him a while for him to agree to let us, put it in the film. And I think the kids were shocked when they found out, and I think they didn't find out until watching this film that he was a police officer. So it's definitely not something that he broadcasts. We found it fascinating, just as I'm sure you did watching it.
Yeah. So does anybody have any questions? Here's the mics.
All right, well, my question is really simple. I was just wondering how you guys and your team are giving back to this community after creating this movie.
So what we're hoping to do, we are doing we're planning on releasing the film this coming October in theaters, and our idea is to have a scholarship fund that we are raising in conjunction with the marketing of the film that helps the students from both of these schools in getting scholarships to college. Because, you know, again, watching specifically Mario's story, you know, they do need help, especially on the financial side. So that's something that, you know, we're doing in conjunction with the release of the film.
And what was your name?
Stephanie.
Stephanie from?
I'm from here, but originally from Houston.
From Houston.
I grew up in Houston in the oldest Hispanic neighborhood.
Okay.
Kind of like East LA.
Not Magnolia Park? Okay, yeah.
Oh, very cool.
Awesome.
Yeah, so I kind of related
Yeah.
to the story a little bit in that way. But thank you for answering that question.
Thank you for the question. Any other questions? Yes, sir. If you can say your name and where you're from.
My name is Carlos Gonzalez Gutierrez. I'm Consul General of Mexico here. And I congratulate you for your work. I think that it's amazing, and I can tell you you're going to have great success starting, and I hope a wide distribution will help. My question has to do with all these complexities that you try to capture in the movie. Because I lived in LA for 7 years, I know that East LA is a traditional old Mexican neighborhood, and that most people there are living through gentrification,
Yeah.
and they are second, third generation people who arrived when the big hazaña was to cross the railroad tracks, right? But now you have Huntington Park, you have Southgate, you have Bell, you have many other high schools and neighborhoods and teams where it's first generation immigrants, non-Mexican, Latinos but not Mexican. And I wonder whether you could tell me a bit if you found those tensions between the old traditional Mexican-American family, Chicano families from the east side, and those who come from southeast Los Angeles and other areas where immigrants are much more newcomers and non-Mexican.
That's interesting, and we did actually notice that a little bit, and I think you kind of, you know, hit the nail on the head at the beginning of, you know, all of the layers of complexity that we tried to get into the movie. I mean, there's so many different stories and so many different, you know, layers to what we were trying to tell here, and that was something that, you know, kind of surprised us a little bit because we didn't, you know, fully understand, you know, that was happening. But, you know, we had to, like, the first cut of this movie was, you know, probably 3.5 hours long, and trying to get in, you know, even the story of Stevie coming into, you know, being the immigrant in the immigrant neighborhood was complex enough that, you know, just there were so many things that we could have opened and explored with this movie, and only having, I mean, we like to keep our movies 90 minutes, and this one is like 99 or 100 minutes, so even trying to cram it into that. But I do think that it was, you know, something that we did, you know, definitely see, but just were not able to explore in a way that you would be able to understand it in the movie, unfortunately.
Thank you for that question. Yep.
Thank you for this project. It was really beautiful. It's so powerful to see your stories told and see your community and your history represented in a film. I would just love to hear what some of the reactions were when you showed the students and the teachers this film. What was the reaction?
I mean, they absolutely love the film, both communities, because it's shining a spotlight on a place that doesn't generally get, you know, acknowledged. And, you know, it's telling the story of this rich community and this rich history and this game that a lot of people don't know about. So the community was incredibly supportive when we made the film. Both schools were incredibly supportive when we made the film, and I think there's a lot of excitement of us being able to get this out in the biggest possible way.
Another question? Thank you. Yes, sir. Remember name and where you're from?
Jay from Dallas, and I was interested to hear that your work also included No Place on Earth. So in terms of the documentary genre, have you seen in your work, you know, through this documentary, social justice, identifying these untold stories. Um, just kind of what's your thought process?
I mean, look, we're always trying to find, either stories that haven't been told before or stories that you think you know that, we're shedding new light on. So, yeah, the movie No Place on Earth was a Holocaust movie, but a story of the Holocaust that I don't think anybody had ever really heard before. It was about a group of people who survived the Holocaust, living in a cave for over 2 years, not once coming out. And it's similar with this. It's a story about football and a story about immigration that you just would never have expected, and hopefully really causes conversation, in a way that again, it's just you weren't expecting to walk out thinking about either of those two things together in this way. And I think we're always looking for new angles and new stories that do that create conversation in that way.
Thank you for the question. Any other questions? Okay. I have at least one or two more before we end, or if you want to add anything else, but always I'm a person of reflection and feedback for myself. So for you, what was your own one or two personal learnings doing this film that we haven't heard?
That's a tough one. Personal learnings doing this film. I guess one thing was, we tried to do a lot, and it goes back to Carlos's question. It took us a long time to edit this film just because there was so many layers and stories and characters, and we had filmed, I think initially we were filming 9 guys, and that was 9 players, plus the 2 coaches, plus the principals, plus we had a teacher. So it was, just an overwhelming, we could have, cut this into a 10-part series. And, something we definitely learned throughout this process was figuring out early on that you can't tell every story. You have to figure out what are the things that are going to bring, the main stories and the main conversation to the forefront in the biggest way. And I think you're always trying to create options for yourself when you're filming a documentary. And I think in this instance, we potentially just created too many options with too many stories, and getting it, distilling it down to this was definitely a challenge because of that.
Awesome. Well, thank you for that. My last question, I'll end with, if anybody has one more question. Okay. So I think for me, this was probably the most powerful, I think, because at the end, it was this idea about the relativism of the American dream. The idea that you had these students, these kids, talking about the American dream, where they may not grasp the American dream because of the social circumstances that we saw in the film. So for you, and to her question, where will they end up, or what are your thoughts in students, not only Joseph, Mario, and Willie, but students across the country who rely on football as a life lesson, right? I think the coach's quote was, "Football is about adjustments, just like life is about adjustment." So, taking into consideration again the relativism of the American dream and these kids, what do you think needs to happen in these kinds of social situations that we can take back home wherever we're from and help ameliorate a lot of these circumstances for them?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the main things was just asking them that question, to really make them think about, what does that mean? What is the American dream? Because at the end of the day, a lot of people, you're just going through life. You're not stopping to think about that. And making these kids take a step back for a second, looking at their own circumstances and thinking about that. Is it hard work? Is it creating opportunities for yourself? All of these kids were forced to think about that just because we were filming them and we were asking them questions about it. And, part of what we would love to happen with this film is that kids watch this movie, kids, potentially who are in similar, scenarios as the kids in the film, and ask themselves that question, and make them think about what does that mean and what can they do to be a part of that and to achieve and to, you know, as the grandmother tells Joseph in the movie, to triumph. And what does triumph mean?
Okay. Anybody else have any more questions before we end? Okay. Well, can I have another huge round of applause for Mr. Rafael Mormon? Anything else? Where can we see this film next, if anything?
Hopefully in theaters in October.
Awesome. Alrighty. Thank you again.